Why was it always her silence that people seemed to prefer? Why was it so easy for others to erase her, as if the years she had carried across oceans, the duty, the scars, the rank, were all invisible? Clare Morgan remembered the first time it happened, not from an enemy, not from someone in uniform, but from her own family. The letter had come months earlier, addressed to her, crisp with the weight of recognition, an invitation to speak at the Veterans Memorial. Her name printed in bold, not as a courtesy, but as a voice the community wanted to hear. 20 years of service distilled into a moment that might have finally allowed her to stand where her story belonged. But she never knew. The envelope was slit open long before it reached her hands. The reply sent in her name, typed clean and cold. She is busy with family duties and cannot attend. Her mother-in-law had written it. Eleanor, the matriarch with the practiced smile who believed she knew better, who believed Clare's years at sea, her deployments, her nights without sleep, her quiet medals, were nothing more than a distraction from what she should be doing. Family dinners, church events, smiling at the right tables. The realization came later, when Clare stumbled across the torn envelope in Eleanor's study. That moment carved something deep inside her, a fracture that never sealed. It wasn't just the insult. It was the certainty that in her mother-in-law's world, she would never be seen for who she was. Not as Commander Morgan. Not even as Clare. Just the girl who married her son. The memory sat heavy that Sunday morning as she walked the path toward the fellowship hall. Leaves cracked under her boots. The air carried the first bite of late fall. She carried a tray of salad, hands steady, heart quiet but bracing for the day ahead. Inside, voices filled the space, spoons clinking against porcelain, the scent of coffee rising like steam off a battlefield. Everyone moved easily, comfortably, except her. She set the tray down and scanned the room. Eleanor was already in her element, sweeping between tables, her laugh bright and deliberate. When she leaned toward two friends, her words carried just enough to cut. She just works in an office. Better not let her show up in uniform, pretending it's more than it is. The laughter that followed was soft, almost polite, but it carried weight. Clare didn't flinch. She adjusted the tray, her face calm, every movement deliberate. She had chosen a navy sheath dress that morning, quiet and simple. No uniform, no flourish. Just the silver star pinned to her chest for the shipmate she'd lost 2 years ago. A private promise, not a performance. Her phone vibrated once in her pocket. A reminder she wasn't free, not even here. She was on duty, low-level standby, but standby nonetheless. If the call came, she would answer, no matter how many potluck dishes surrounded her. She stood near the kitchen door, half in shadow, half in sight, a woman holding two worlds at once. In one world, every rank she had earned mattered. Every decision could change lives. In the other, Eleanor's whispers cut her down to just a volunteer, just a daughter-in-law. She had been erased once before, but today she told herself would be different. Still, she couldn't forget the way her husband reacted the night before, when she had finally spoken the truth. "Did you know your mother hid my invitation last year?" she had asked. The lamp cast long shadows across his face. He shifted, looked away. "She probably thought you didn't want the attention. She worries about you, that's all." The dismissal landed harder than the insult itself. He hadn't been surprised. He hadn't been outraged. And then, almost reluctantly, he had admitted the rest. "She called your office once, asked them to change your duty schedule, said you needed more time with family." The words crashed through her like cold water. Not once, not twice. Multiple times she had been undermined, not by an adversary, not by a rival, but by the woman whose approval she never asked for, yet who wielded control like a blade. And worse, her husband had let it happen. That silence had its own kind of betrayal. Clare remembered staring out the window that night. Darkness pressed hard against the glass. Inside her chest, Something burned steady, not anger exactly, but resolve. Tomorrow, she promised herself. Tomorrow, I will not let her erase me again. Now standing at the edge of the fellowship hall, her heart beat steady but sharp. The chatter, the laughter, the clinking dishes all blurred into background noise. Her eyes tracked the seating chart taped to the wall. She scanned once, twice, a third time. Her name wasn't there. When she asked the coordinator, the woman's cheeks flushed pink. "I'm sorry. You've been assigned to a side table near the kitchen, easier to help with food service." The words landed heavy. Weeks earlier, she had glimpsed the draft email, her name printed clearly among the VIPs at her husband's side. But here, in the final version, she had been moved to the margins. Clearing trash later, she spotted a crumpled program in the bin. She smoothed it out with trembling hands. There it was. Commander Morgan, U.S. Navy, listed proudly in the original. And then the new one, the one in circulation, stripped, reduced to assistant event staff. Her chest tightened, the air felt sharp. But before she could process it, her phone buzzed. Duty officer, secure line, a ferry in the bay, medical emergency on board. In seconds, she had her laptop open, headset pressed to her ear, voice calm as steel. Proceed with ferry intercept. Patch Harbor Patrol on frequency 16. Her fingers flew across the keys, relaying instructions. Life or death cutting through the noise of clattering dishes and cheerful chatter. When the call ended, she slipped the device away, but already whispers followed her. Eyes lingered. Some looked amused, others curious, most dismissive. "She just likes to play soldier," Eleanor's voice carried again, sugar-coated but sharp. "Always pretending to be busy. Isn't it funny?" Laughter rippled. The humiliation struck deep, steady as a drumbeat in her ribs. And yet she didn't rise. She didn't defend herself, not yet. Because something inside her whispered steady, "Wait, your moment will come. And when it does, the truth will speak louder than any denial." She thought of walking out. The thought pressed at her chest like a door half opened, promising relief on the other side. But she didn't. She stayed seated at the small side table, the plastic badge gleaming against her dress like a scar. Volunteer. That's what they'd labeled her. Not commander, not officer, not even veteran. Just volunteer. Her name, her years, her sacrifice, all collapsed into one word chosen for her by someone else. She traced the edge of the badge with her fingertip, the sharp corner biting against her skin. She wanted to rip it off, to let it fall to the floor, but instead she pinned it tighter, pressing it into her dress until the plastic bent slightly. Let them see it, she thought. Let them think I've been reduced. The truth doesn't vanish because someone refuses to see it. Around her the tables filled. Voices rose and blended, the hum of community settling into comfort. 100 conversations, not one of them meant for her. She sat silent, watching from the margin. And yet her silence wasn't empty, it was waiting. When the coordinator approached, her apology was thin, her eyes darting nervously. "I'm so sorry, but you won't be speaking today." Eleanor thought it might come across as too military. The words pressed against Claire's ribs, threatening to steal her breath. She forced calm into her voice. "I see." But when she glanced at the projection screen, her stomach dropped. Where her name had once appeared, bold and clear, the slide now showed only spouse of Daniel Morgan. Erased again, reduced again. She asked quietly for a microphone, just a moment, just a word. The coordinator hesitated, then handed it to her. But when Claire lifted it to her lips, nothing came. The mic was dead. "Orders," the woman whispered, shame flickering in her eyes. Claire's gaze swept across the hall. Guests exchanging puzzled looks, some shaking their heads as if something odd had just happened, but no one daring to ask. In the corner of the screen, she caught the flicker of a file being dragged into the recycle bin. Commander speech draft. Deleted. Her throat tightened, but she didn't storm, she didn't shout. She opened her phone, pressed record, and let the lens capture every detail. The silences, the whispers, the deliberate erasures. Go ahead, she thought, erase me again, but the truth cannot be deleted. The fellowship hall pulsed with noise, 100 voices weaving together into a restless hum. At the front, Eleanor sparkled in her red jacket, hosting like royalty, her smile wide and rehearsed. Clare sat still, the badge heavy against her chest, the phone warm in her palm. She knew the reversal was coming. She didn't know how or when, but something in her bones told her the tide would turn. And when it did, it would be irreversible. The doors opened. A man in a dark suit entered, clipboard in hand, voice sharp and commanding. Is Commander Morgan here? The Admiral will want to greet her as soon as he arrives. The air shifted. Conversation paused mid-sentence, forks stilled against plates, heads turned. Claire's hand twitched, ready to rise, but Eleanor's voice cut across the silence. Oh, there's no commander here. She just works in an office, helps out at church events. The word struck like a slap. The aide frowned, scanning the room. Clare sat frozen, her fists curling tight against her sides. Nails bit into her palms. Enough. Inside her head, the word repeated steady as a drum. Enough. She didn't stand. Not yet. But she felt the moment coming closer, pressing toward her like the rising tide. The truth had been buried, erased, smothered, but it was still alive, and soon it would break through. Because dignity doesn't beg to be seen. It waits, and when the moment arrives, it acts. Why was she still sitting at the side table, badge pressed against her chest like a brand, when everything inside her wanted to rise? Why was she letting the silence stretch, when the room had already been carved into before and after? Because she knew timing was everything. In combat, in command, in life. She had learned that lesson long before this fellowship hall, long before Eleanor's whispers. Timing was how you survived storms at sea. Timing was how you led a ship through hostile waters. Timing was how you carried the lives of others without breaking under their weight. So she waited. The aide had already left, confused, his eyes unsettled. The crowd, for the moment, believed Eleanor, but not entirely. Clare could feel it. A thread of doubt had been planted. And sometimes doubt was the first crack in a wall built too high. She glanced down at her phone. The ferry emergency had resolved, the patient evacuated, the patrol rerouted, the report filed. Another day's work hidden inside the silence of her own corner. No one here would know. No one would understand that even in this hall, even at this table, her responsibilities carried weight beyond their potluck chatter. She thought of the sailor she had lost, the reason she wore the silver star on her chest. It had been a training exercise gone wrong, a moment of human error in rough waters, the kind of mistake that could never be taken back. She had carried the memory like a stone in her chest, heavy but solid. She wore the star not to display, but to remember, to anchor. Here, though, the pin might as well have been invisible. The laughter at Eleanor's table grew louder, sharper, the sound of a performance reaching its audience. Clare caught fragments, just a helper, always so dramatic, not really Navy. Her jaw tightened. She wanted to rise, to walk across the room, to lift the microphone and speak her truth. But no, not yet. Instead, she let herself remember. The day she first raised her right hand. The oath that bound her, not to approval, not to recognition, but to service. She thought of the deployments, the salt air in her lungs, the midnight watches when the ocean stretched endless, black and cold. She thought of the faces of her crew, the ones who had trusted her, followed her, believed in her judgment. In those moments she had never been erased, never been dismissed. Her worth had never been questioned. It was only here in this family, in this small-town fellowship hall, that she was reduced to nothing. The irony wasn't lost on her. You could face storms, cross oceans, stand before admirals, and still be undone by whispers over coffee cups. The thought almost made her laugh. almost. But beneath the bitterness was something else, a truth sharper than pain. She didn't need this haul to validate her. She didn't need Eleanor's approval to confirm her rank. What she needed was to reclaim her own ground, to stop letting others speak in her place. Because silence, she knew now, was no longer strength. It was surrender. She shifted slightly in her chair, her spine straightening. Her eyes locked on the double doors at the far end of the hall. The Admiral hadn't arrived yet, but he would. And when he did, this hall would no longer belong to Eleanor. The minutes stretched. The chatter grew restless. People leaned across tables, voices weaving into a low hum of curiosity. They had heard the aide. They had seen Eleanor dismiss it, but questions lingered. Clare could feel their eyes drifting toward her, subtle, cautious, curious. She didn't meet their gaze. She didn't need to. Instead, she sat still, calm as steel, waiting for the tide. And then the moment came. The doors opened again, and the air shifted as if the very room inhaled at once. The Admiral stepped inside. The chatter stilled, chairs scraped as people rose to their feet, every head turned. Clare stayed seated. She didn't need to rise for recognition, not this time. The Admiral's presence carried through the hall not just authority but weight. He moved with the ease of command, clasping hands, nodding warmly, his eyes sweeping across faces with practiced precision. Clare remained still, the plastic badge pressed against her dress, the star pinned to her chest catching the overhead lights. For a moment she thought he would pass by, carried on the tide of expectation. But then his gaze caught hers. Recognition flickered, his eyes lit, and then unmistakably he smiled. He angled his steps away from the crowded VIP table, away from Eleanor's stage, and walked straight toward the corner where Clare sat. "Good to see you, Commander Morgan," he said, his voice carrying across the hall. "I read your after-action on the ferry medevac drills. Excellent work." The words rang out, sharp and clear. The hall froze. Every fork stilled, every whisper died, every face turned. And Clare, seated at the kitchen door with a volunteer badge pressed against her chest, suddenly stood revealed. The silence that followed was almost unbearable in its clarity. Clare could feel every eye on her, could hear the absence of sound louder than any applause. The Admiral's voice had cut through the air like steel through silk, slicing apart the fragile web Eleanor had spun for years. "Commander Morgan." 2 words, and the room shifted. Clare rose slowly, not in defiance, not in anger, but in quiet acknowledgement. Her movements deliberate, calm, measured. She lifted her chin, meeting the Admiral's gaze with steady eyes. "Admiral," she said softly. Her voice didn't need volume. The hall carried it for her. The ripple began instantly. Whispers darted like sparks across dry grass. Surprise, confusion, realization, the current moving faster than anyone could contain. Across the room, Eleanor faltered. Her bright jacket seemed suddenly too loud, her smile brittle, her face pale beneath the practiced polish. She gripped the back of a chair, as though steadying herself against a tide she hadn't expected. For years she had crafted the narrative, Clare as helper, as volunteer, as background. Now, with a single greeting, that story was undone. The Admiral extended his hand, formal but warm. Clare accepted it, her grip firm, her expression calm. "Your report was sharp," he continued, his voice carrying easily. "We implemented several of your recommendations last month, saved time, saved resources. Well done." The silence deepened, heavy with recognition. Clare inclined her head. "Thank you, sir." That was all. She didn't explain herself. She didn't defend. She didn't need to. Because dignity doesn't shout, it simply stands. The coordinator, pale and stammering, hurried to the stage. "Apologies, everyone. There seems to have been a mistake with the program slides." Her hands fumbled with the remote. A click, a pause, and then the projection shifted. "Commander Clare Morgan, U.S. Navy." The words glowed across the screen. Undeniable, undeniable, undeniable. The crowd erupted in murmurs. Some gasped openly, others whispered sharply to their neighbors. Faces turned toward Clare, expressions shifting from condescension to shock to something closer to respect. And in that shifting, Eleanor's entire stage collapsed. Clare didn't move. She let the weight of the truth settle on the room, let it fill the silence until even the walls seemed to absorb it. The Admiral inclined his head once more, then stepped back, giving her space, leaving the spotlight not on himself but on her. And for the first time in years, Clare felt seen, not because she demanded it, not because she fought for it, but because the truth had spoken and no one could erase it now. She drew a slow breath, the silver star on her chest pressing lightly into her skin, a reminder, a promise, a tether to everything that had brought her here. She looked across the hall at faces she had known for years, neighbors, friends, church members, people who had believed the whispers, who had accepted the erasures. Some looked ashamed, some avoided her eyes, but a very few lifted their chins, recognition dawning. She didn't need their applause, she didn't need their validation. But she wanted them to know she had always been more than the silence they gave her. She stepped back toward her chair, calm, composed, unshaken. The badge still pinned to her chest, the plastic bent slightly from where she had pressed it down. Volunteer, commander, daughter-in-law, outsider. She was all of it and none of it. Because the truth wasn't in the labels. It was in the life she had lived. The Admiral's words still echoed in her ears. Excellent work. She sat, her hands folded neatly in her lap as the chatter resumed around her, sharper now, more curious. The event hadn't ended. Not yet. The speeches, the prayers, the toasts, they would all come. But the day had already turned. And in the quiet of her own chest, Clare felt something ease. The fracture that had run through her since the day she found that hidden letter, it hadn't healed, but it had opened into something else. Resolve. This wasn't about Eleanor anymore. Not entirely. It wasn't about her husband's silence or the community's ignorance. It wasn't even about the luncheon. It was about drawing a line, a boundary. No one would speak in her place again. And as she lifted her gaze toward the stage, watching Eleanor shift uncomfortably in her chair, Clare thought, this is only the beginning. Why did the silence in the hall feel heavier than the speeches that followed? Why did every toast, every polite laugh, every prayer sound like it was being spoken into a room that had already been changed forever? Because the Admiral's greeting still hung in the air like smoke after a fire. Clare sat quietly at her side table, her back straight, her hands folded, her face calm. The volunteer badge still clung to her dress, its edges bent, its label mocking, but suddenly it carried no weight. Because the room had heard something louder, clearer, undeniable. Commander Morgan. The title had cut through every whisper, every false story, every attempt to erase her. Still, Eleanor recovered quickly. That was her gift. She smoothed her jacket, painted her smile back into place, and lifted her glass at just the right moment. To our veterans, she said brightly, her voice pitched high, reaching for command. To their sacrifices and to the families who support them. The crowd raised glasses, murmuring agreement, falling back into the script of the event. But the energy was fractured. Conversations trailed off mid-sentence. People glanced sideways at Clare, their expressions unsettled. Some still doubted, some tried to dismiss, but doubt was enough. Clare lifted her glass too, though she didn't drink. She stared at the amber liquid, her reflection fractured in its surface. She wondered what they saw now when they looked at her. Not what she was, they had always refused to see that, but what they couldn't deny. Recognition had cracked the silence, but cracks were only beginnings. She thought back to the night before, her husband's tired face under the dim lamp. She probably thought you didn't want the attention. His voice had been casual, almost defensive, as if erasure was care, as if betrayal could be softened by intention. And she had realized then, silence was its own betrayal, his silence, her silence. She set the glass down and straightened. At the front, the speeches droned on. Local officials, donors, the pastor, each voice wrapped in polite formality, each phrase well rehearsed, but Clare hardly heard them. Her mind drifted back through the years, across the ocean she had crossed, the nights she had stood watch. She thought of the deployment where her crew had stared at her, eyes wide, waiting for her decision. The storm had risen fast, waves hammering the deck, radar screens lit with confusion. One wrong call and they could have lost the ship. She had chosen, calm, clear, decisive, and they had survived. No one here would ever know that. No one here would understand what it meant to carry lives in your voice, in your judgment, in your silence. And yet here she was, reduced to helper, to office worker, to volunteer. The irony almost made her smile, almost. Because now, after the Admiral's words, the irony no longer burned. It steadied her. She didn't need the hall to validate her. She didn't need Eleanor's approval. But she would not let herself be erased again. The speeches ended, applause scattered, plates clinked, chairs scraped. The event shifted into motion again, but the tension lingered unspoken. Clare felt it in the air, the quiet glances, the restless energy. Some avoided her entirely, as if ashamed to have doubted. Others looked at her with new calculation, curiosity sharpening into something like respect. And Eleanor avoided her eyes altogether. For years, Eleanor had controlled the narrative with whispers, with small cuts, with quiet edits to the truth. But control was slipping. Clare could feel it. She stood slowly, excusing herself from the table. She walked through the crowd with measured steps, her head high, her posture straight. She felt the shift as people parted slightly, as conversations hushed in her wake. Not all, not everyone, but enough. When she reached the back hallway, she exhaled. The quiet hit her like a wave, and for a moment she leaned against the wall, her chest tight. It wasn't victory, it wasn't vindication. It was something smaller, something steadier. A beginning. Her phone buzzed again. Another duty update. She answered quickly, her voice calm, clipped, efficient. The kind of voice that carried weight in the places that mattered. When she hung up, she stared at the dark screen for a moment. Her reflection looked back at her, tired eyes, straight jaw, the small silver star pinned against her chest. She whispered so softly only she could hear, "You are not invisible." The words weren't for anyone else. They weren't for Eleanor. They weren't for the community. They were for herself. Because the most dangerous erasure was what others did. It was what you began to believe. She pressed her hand lightly against the star, feeling its sharp edges against her palm. She closed her eyes and remembered the sailor she had lost, his laughter, his loyalty, the way he had trusted her. She carried him still, in every decision, in every silence. She straightened and stepped back into the hall. The chatter swelled again as she entered, but the air still carried that undercurrent, that tension. She moved through it calmly, her face composed. She didn't need to speak. Not yet. Because sometimes silence wasn't surrender. Sometimes silence was strength, sharpened and waiting. And tonight, she would decide which it would be. The next toast began, but Clare hardly heard the words. Something else caught her attention, the projection screen flickering at the front of the hall. The technician had left the computer open, and a small window hovered in the corner. An archive of files. Her name was there again, Commander Speech Draft. It hadn't been fully deleted, just buried. Claire's breath caught. She wondered if anyone else had seen it. Probably not, but she had. Proof. Proof that she had been invited. Proof that someone had tried to erase her voice. Her pulse steadied. She didn't move. Not yet. She let the knowledge settle like a weapon she wouldn't draw until the moment demanded. At the front, Eleanor stood to introduce the keynote. Her voice rang bright, steady, almost triumphant, as if nothing had shifted. "It is my honor," she said, "to welcome." but her voice trembled just slightly on the word honor. Claire noticed, a few others did too, a tremor in the mask, a crack in the glass. The keynote spoke at length, his words weaving through patriotism, sacrifice, community. Claire listened distantly, the phrases sliding over her like water. She had heard them all before. Not empty, not false, but distant. Words too polished to hold weight. Her eyes scanned the room instead. Faces bent toward plates. Conversations whispered behind hands. The undercurrent hummed doubt, curiosity, unease. She realized then, Eleanor hadn't just erased her once. She had built an entire narrative around her absence. For years, the community had accepted it, believed it. And undoing that story would take more than a single greeting. It would take truth spoken aloud. The keynote ended. Applause scattered again. Plates cleared. The hum of conversation rose as people moved toward coffee and dessert. Claire remained still, her chair pressed against the wall, her badge bent and gleaming. She felt calm, steady, resolved. Then she stood. Her decision was quiet, not dramatic, not theatrical, just necessary. She walked toward the stage. Not fast, not hesitant, but measured. A murmur spread as people noticed, conversations breaking, eyes turning. At the foot of the steps, she paused, scanning the stage. The microphone still sat there, muted, forgotten. The screen still glowed faintly behind it, her name buried in the files. She reached for the microphone. The coordinator hurried forward, panic flickering across her face. It's not on," she whispered. Claire looked at her calmly. "Turn it on." The woman hesitated, her hands trembling. Then slowly she reached down and flipped the switch. The mic hummed softly to life. The hall stilled. Claire lifted it, her hands steady. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. "I am always willing to serve," she said, her words calm, deliberate. "To help, but I will not accept being erased." Her voice carried, not loud but clear. It filled the silence like water seeping into cracks, reaching everywhere at once. "My value is not something anyone else gets to define." Gasps rippled, murmurs rose, faces shifted, expressions sharp with recognition, with shame, with unease. Claire didn't look at Eleanor. She didn't need to. She simply lowered the microphone, placed it gently back on the stand, and stepped away. No anger, no spectacle, just truth. The Admiral inclined his head from his seat, his expression unreadable but steady, his respect unmistakable. And in that moment, Claire felt the fracture inside her ease again. It wasn't healed, but it was no longer breaking. As she walked back toward her chair, shoulders straight, head high, she thought of the silver star against her chest, of the sailor she had lost, of the promise she carried. She thought of the oath she had taken. And she realized her service was not something that could ever be erased by silence, by whispers, by edits on a program slide. Because dignity doesn't vanish. It waits. And when the moment comes, it acts. Why did the applause sound different now? Why did every clap feel hesitant, as though people weren't sure whether they were celebrating or confessing? Claire sat back down at her side table, her movements unhurried, her face calm. The microphone had been returned, the stage reclaimed by the program, yet the energy of the hall was unsettled. Something had shifted, and everyone knew it. Eleanor tried to regain control. She stood, shoulders squared, smile polished back into place, her voice a touch too loud as she introduced the dessert service. Her words floated into the air, sugary but brittle. The crowd responded politely, but the room no longer bent toward her. The Admiral's greeting, Claire's quiet words into the microphone, those moments lingered heavier than any dessert tray. Claire sipped her water, her hands steady, though inside her chest her pulse still beat with the echoes of her own voice. "I will not accept being erased." It had been simple, quiet, almost restrained, and yet it had carried like thunder. Her phone buzzed once more. Another duty update. She excused herself, stepped into the hallway, and pressed the phone to her ear. "Yes, Commander Morgan," the voice on the line greeted, crisp and direct. "Harbor Control reports the ferry's passenger is stable. Transfer complete." "Good," Claire answered, her tone clipped but warm. "Send my thanks to the team." She hung up, slid the phone back into her pocket, and leaned briefly against the wall. Duty never disappeared. Not for family, not for events, not for humiliation or vindication. And maybe that was the point. Her life wasn't about this haul. It wasn't about Eleanor. It wasn't even about the community that had chosen silence over recognition. It was about the oath she had taken, the service she had lived. Still, she knew the weight of what had happened here couldn't be dismissed. This wasn't a battlefield, but it was a turning point. She thought back to the years of quiet erasure, the hidden letter, the intercepted phone calls, the missed opportunities explained away as her own disinterest. And she thought of her husband, his silence in the living room the night before. His words still echoed, heavy and sharp. "She probably thought you didn't want the attention." It wasn't just Eleanor who had reduced her. It was him too, by standing aside, by letting it happen. The ache of that realization pressed against her ribs as she stepped back into the hall. The crowd buzzed with low energy, whispers slipping between tables like currents under the surface. She caught fragments. "Did you hear the Admiral?" But she said, "I never knew." The weight of revelation spread slowly, seeping through the room. Claire returned to her table. She didn't eat. She didn't drink. She simply sat, her back straight, her eyes clear, waiting. The event coordinator avoided her gaze. The technician kept glancing nervously toward the stage, as if afraid of what file might flicker next. And Eleanor was unraveling. Claire could see it in her posture, in the way her smile faltered when she thought no one was looking, in the tightness of her grip on her napkin. She was losing control. For years, she had controlled the narrative with whispers. Now the whispers were turning against her. But Claire didn't feel triumph. She didn't feel victory. She felt something quieter. Sorrow. Because the truth was, she had never wanted to fight her mother-in-law. She had never wanted to prove herself here in this hall. She had wanted peace. Recognition, maybe. Respect, certainly. But not this battle, not this fracture. And yet here they were. She pressed her hand lightly against the silver star pinned to her dress, grounding herself. She remembered her shipmate's laugh, the way his eyes lit in the mess hall, the trust he had carried in her decisions. She wore his memory as anchor and compass. And she thought, would he want me to fight like this? Would he see this as honor or as distraction? The question lingered, heavy and unresolved. At the front of the hall, the Admiral rose to speak. The room stilled instantly, every head turning, every fork set down. He spoke briefly, directly, his words measured. He thanked the veterans, the families, the community. He praised service, sacrifice, resilience. And then, without pause, he said, "Commander Morgan is someone I trust in critical operations. That is not in question." The words rang out, steady and final. The room froze again. Claire felt the breath catch in her chest, not because she needed the validation, not because she craved recognition, but because truth, spoken aloud, was like light breaking through heavy clouds. It revealed everything. Eleanor's mask cracked further. Her lips parted slightly, but no words came. Her hands trembled where they clutched the edge of the tablecloth. And Claire sat calm, still steady. Because sometimes the most powerful thing you could do was not to rise, not to shout, not to demand, but to remain, visible, undeniable, unshaken. The Admiral's words hung in the air long after he sat down. Claire could feel the silence pressing against her skin, a silence not of erasure this time, but of reckoning. The kind that comes when a truth long buried rises into the open, undeniable. She didn't move. She didn't need to. Her presence was enough. Across the hall, people shifted uncomfortably. Some avoided her eyes entirely, their faces flushed with the shame of complicity. Others leaned forward, studying her as if seeing her for the first time. A few gave the smallest of nods, acknowledgement, not pity, recognition, not performance. Clare returned none of it. Her gaze was steady, her face calm, because this moment wasn't about them. It wasn't about their recognition or their shame. It was about reclaiming what had been hers all along. The program stumbled forward, awkward now. The coordinator's voice wavered as she announced the raffle, the dessert table, the silent auction. But no one seemed to care. The energy of the room had shifted. Clare sat, her hands folded, her posture upright, her mind steady. Inside, though, something deeper stirred. For years she had carried the quiet weight of being unseen. She had told herself it didn't matter, that her worth wasn't measured in recognition. She had believed that silence was dignity, that invisibility was strength. But now she understood. Silence had become surrender. And tonight she had chosen differently. Her phone buzzed again. She glanced down. Another duty update. Brief, routine, unremarkable. She responded quickly, her voice low and precise. When she hung up, she realized several people nearby were watching her, listening to the calm authority in her tone. And she thought, this is who I am. Whether they see it or not, whether they believe it or not, this is who I will always be. When she lifted her eyes again, she caught Eleanor's gaze across the hall. For the first time, Eleanor didn't look away. Her face was pale, her smile gone, her hands trembling slightly. But her eyes held something Clare had never seen before. Not approval, not acceptance, not even regret. But fear. Fear of losing the story she had built. Fear of losing the control she had carried for years. Clare didn't return anger. She didn't return triumph. She simply held her gaze, calm and steady, until Eleanor looked down. The tables turned back to their chatter, trying to sew together a normalcy that no longer existed. But the fabric was torn, the seams split wide. Because truth, once spoken, cannot be unsaid. The evening wound down. Guests collected coats, thanked hosts, murmured goodbyes. The Admiral left with his aides, his presence lingering like a shadow of command even after he was gone. Clare remained seated until the room had thinned. She didn't rush. She didn't hide. She let the eyes linger as they left, let the whispers weave their threads. When the hall was nearly empty, she stood. She walked to the back door slowly, her heels clicking softly against the wood floor, each step a rhythm of resolve. At the exit, she paused. She pressed her hand lightly against the silver star pinned to her dress. The memory of her shipmate flickered again, his laugh, his trust, his absence. She carried him still, and she always would. She whispered so softly only she could hear, "You are not erased." Then she stepped outside into the cold night. The air was sharp, bracing, alive. She lifted her chin, her breath clouding in the darkness, and felt clarity settle in her chest. She didn't need their applause. She didn't need Eleanor's approval. She didn't even need their recognition. Because dignity doesn't speak to be heard. It speaks because it must. And tonight she had spoken.